Hello, kids. It's me again. I wanted to say that I enjoyed talking with your class the other day about costs in chapter 8 in your textbook. And I wanted to talk about something today that I think you're going to have a little bit of trouble understanding. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking that you have a little bit of trouble understanding everything in economics, but I think that this is a particularly difficult topic to understand: long run costs. Now, we're going to circle back to long run costs in a second, but before we do, I want to say something about short run costs, right? Now, Mr. Spinola has been dutifully talking with you about cost in chapter 8 in your textbook, and by now I'm sure he established the average variable cost, the average fixed cost, and the average total cost. The average total cost is ultimately the per unit cost of production. So what does it cost per unit to produce a product? Now, I can tell you this, that there isn't a business out there that doesn't know that. The per unit cost of production is a really big deal, right? And in the short run, what I'm sure Mr. Spinola told you is that the per unit cost of production, or the average total cost, falls initially, bottoms, and then rises. So this is illustrated throughout chapter 8, an average total cost that falls, bottoms, and rises. Oh boy, do I wish I had a chalkboard in a classroom right now, because I would illustrate that so beautifully, right? But that might be coming. I'm not sure yet, but that might be coming. But in the meantime, the question is, why does that curve take its shape? And the answer has to do with something called the marginal cost. Oh, but kind instructor, what's the marginal cost? Well, the marginal cost is the change in the total cost associated with producing an additional product. Well, let me say that again. The change in the total cost associated with producing an additional product. Write this down. Write down delta TC, right? Right? Delta TC. Delta is a triangle, right? Delta TC. Delta means change. Change in TC over a line, delta Q. Triangle Q. So write it down. Delta, a triangle, TC, over delta Q, and then put equals MC. That means the change in total cost associated with an additional unit of production, the change in quantity of 1, right, equals the marginal cost. Now, in the short run, the marginal cost falls quickly, bottoms, and rises. Falls quickly, bottoms, and rises. Now you might say, instructor, dear retired instructor, right? Why is that the case? Why does the marginal cost take its shape? Because it basically drives the average total cost curve and the average variable cost curve. Well, it does because of the marginal product curve. In the short run, go back in chapter 8. In the short run, we know as you add additional units of an input, labor, to fixed capital, right, the productivity of that labor goes down. So when the productivity of that labor goes down, the additional output that you are producing becomes more costly to produce. So in the short run, we know that at first, marginal product rises, right? When it does, marginal cost falls. When marginal product begins to fall, marginal cost rises. There's an illustration of this in your textbook, right? I think it's on page 166. There's an illustration of this in your book, right? So marginal cost is important, right? It's very important. The margin is important in economics in general. And the reason is economics is about choices, decision making, right? Why people behave in a certain way. Well, economists argue that people make decisions on the margin, right? They think to themselves, now based on what I do, what's going to be the change? And that's on the margin, right? So a firm making a decision whether to produce another product is going to think, how much will it cost me to produce this product, right? What's the marginal cost of the additional product? What's the marginal benefit of producing this additional product? I mean, this notion of marginal cost and marginal benefit is something that really defines economics. So nevertheless, back to the short run. Mr. Spinola, I'm sure, talked to you about the short run cost curves. I'm sure he illustrated it. I'm sure he showed you that in the short run, the average fixed cost falls and 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 falls. The average variable cost falls, bottoms, and rises. The average total cost above them both, because they're the sum of the two, falls, bottoms, and rises, right? I'm sure he showed you that. Then I'm sure he drew a line through that, the marginal cost, and then the marginal cost will intercept with the average variable cost at its lowest point and intercept with the average total cost at its lowest point. Look in your textbook, you'll see that. Oh, if I had a chalk, wish I had a chalkboard. Oh my goodness, a chalkboard and a piece of chalk. That's all you need, kids. You don't need technology and all of that stuff. You just need your brain, a chalkboard, a piece of chalk, and decent instruction. And that's all you need, right? But nevertheless, you don't need the internet. I mean, this is nice, I suppose, but you don't need the internet. That's what you need, right? So nevertheless, again, falling average fixed cost, falling bottoming and rising average variable, falling bottoming and rising average total cost, marginal intercepting at the bottom of the average variable and at the bottom of the average total. Now, the marginal, one notion to always remember, the margin always drags the average in the direction, it always drags the average up or down depending upon its position. So if the marginal is greater than the average is going up. If the margin is less than the average is going down, right? Now, one way to look at that, let's say that you're a bowler. Let's say you're a bowler. I know Mr. Spinola enjoys bowling, right? And he has an average, I'm sure. You ask him, his average is probably 200. So Mr. Spinola goes out and bowls, and he rolls a 200 on average. What if the next time he goes, he rolls a 210? We would say that the 210 is the marginal score. What would happen to his average? It would go up, right? So if the margin is higher than the average goes up. Now let's say he goes out and he's had a bad day because the kids don't understand economics very well, and he rolls a 190. What happens to the average? It goes down. So the margin controls the average. If you look at the illustration in your textbook, as long as the marginal is below the average of either cost, average variable or average total, it will be going down. When they're exactly the same at the bottom, right? When they're exactly the same at the bottom, right? Then it doesn't change. So if Mr. Spinola rolls a 200 and the margin is equal to the average doesn't change. When the margin starts to go above the average, it drags the average total and the average variable up with it. So as firms produce more and diminishing returns set in and marginal cost starts to go up for additional production, costs in the short run are going to go up. And that's the moral of the story. Now, what about the long run? Oh my goodness, the long run. What about the long run, kids? What's the difference between the short run and the long run? If I were your teacher in class, I would ask you that question. And I know that there would be hands flying everywhere. The kids would be dusting the lights with their hands in the air. All of the anxious students would have their hands. Kids at home would be shaking their devices to answer that question. And what they would say, those darn kids, is they would say, in the short run, plant size or plant capacity or capital, all synonymous, is fixed, right? In the long run, it's variable, right? In the long run, plant size is variable. So the long run costs associated with producing is nothing more than a series of short run costs. Now this is illustrated in figure 8.7 in your textbook on page 166, right? This is illustrated. Now, I wanted to mention something about that. The interesting thing about the long run, right? It's like tomorrow. It never comes. Now, I don't want to get philosophical on you, but in theory, you kids are in advanced placement and you're supposed to be advanced students. So maybe we could indulge this for a moment. The long run in any venue, in economics in particular, it never comes. When you get there, it's the short run. It's like tomorrow. Tomorrow never gets here, right? So there's a tomorrow, but when we get there, it will be today. Well, the same is true with the short run and the long run. If you look at that figure, let me check again, 8-7 on page 166, you'll see that they have ACT1, ACT2, ACT3, ACT4, ACT5. Go get your book. Go get your book. Get your book. Go ahead. Go get your book and look at it. Open it up. Oh, that was weird, huh? Opening the book up. Huh? That's odd, right? Open it up. Did anything happen? Did you feel any ill effects from that? Open up the book, right? And look at that figure, and you see ACT1, ACT2, ACT3, ACT4, ATC5. In the long run, the firm can be on any of those curves. In the long run, the firm could be at ACT1. In the long run, it could be at ACT2. In the long run, it could be at ACT3. In the long run, it could be at ACT4 or 5. What's the difference between ACT1, ACT2, ACT3, ACT4, and ACT5? Think about that for a second. Ponder it. What's the difference? What's the difference? What makes the long run the long run? What's the difference? Same thing. The answer is the same. What makes the long run is that capital or plant capacity can vary. So each of those ATCs represents a different plant capacity, right? Now, look at ACT1. At the very lowest point on ACT1, that would be the minimum cost that could be produced. Right? You can't produce any lower than that. They have, and then if you look there, you can say, well, okay, here's how many units they could produce. And then look at ACT2. The minimum cost is less. Now, what's the difference between the two? Which ACT, ACT1 or ACT2, is the bigger plant size? Oh, I'd ask that question. And the kids would be bored, and then none of them would raise their hands, and they would just wait for me to answer. That's how that goes. Maybe somebody would respond. I'm not sure, but if somebody did respond, they would say that ACT2 represents a bigger plant size, right? Because you can produce more. And ACT3 is a bigger yet plant size. And notice what happens when plant size increases, the minimum average total cost declines. Is that true? I mean, intuitively, right? I mean, is that true? Intuitively, it means, does that make sense? That the bigger your plant capacity, the lower the average cost you could produce the product at in the short run? Most people would say yes. And what we call that notion is the economies of scale. If you expand your productive capacity, right, then the average total cost at which you can produce tends to decline, right, the bigger you become. So you're at plant size 1 year, and then you say, if I increase my plant size to plant size 2, I can produce at a lower cost. So in 2 years you do that, and then you're there. And you say, well, if I can increase it in 2 more years, I can reduce my cost to plant size 3. So now when I get to plant size 3, I have the lowest possible cost that I could produce, because I see if I increase my plant size any more, plant size 4, then costs tend to go up. That's called the diseconomies of scale, right? The bigger you get, the more expensive it becomes to produce. Now, if you read in your textbook after page 166, it explains, why, and if we were in class, I would ask you this, what explains economies of scale? Why when plant size expands does it increase? And is it the same in every industry, right? I mean, I think what you could safely say is the bigger the firms in the industry, the larger the plant capacity in industry, like an automaker with a huge factory, Why does an automaker have a huge factory? You say, well, that's because of what they do. Well, yes, that's true, but largely because in the long run, the lowest average total cost that could be obtained is obtained with a large plant size. If I had a smaller plant size, it couldn't compete. So either have to be big or not at all. But what about a pizza shop? I mean, if I have a huge pizza shop or a huge bakery or a huge some other kind, do I get a lot of economies of scale from that? Maybe not. So then you can see that there are varying plant sizes in some industries. It has to do with the extent that the economies of scale influences an industry. And at some point, we talk about a constant return to scale. And this is all discussed at the end of chapter 9, or excuse me, chapter 8 in your textbook, where it doesn't matter what size the plant is over a certain range, you don't really get any cost advantage or disadvantage. And then the diseconomies of scale, as you get bigger, it becomes more costly, it becomes confusing. We'll read about that a little bit. And hopefully, if you do so and you have any questions, you can ask Mr. Spinola or email myself, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I hope this was helpful for you. I'll be back periodically to help out with certain things. Now that the weather's turned bad and I'm not really doing as much outside in my kind of boring retired life, I can appear from every now and then to be helpful. So best wishes to you. I hope this helped you out.